photograph is formal and carefully arranged. 4 children neatly dressed. Elsie is seated on the right, composed and protective, and on the far left sits Albert Joseph Edwards, thin, solemn, and already carrying the long-term damage of mustard gas. This picture captures a moment of stability earned at enormous cost. A family built in the aftermath of war. A father whose service still shaped every breath he took. A mother whose strength held the household together. And children who would grow up in the long shadow of a conflict they never saw, but which defined their lives all the same. Men like Arthur Hodder never returned home. They never married, never held children of their own, never grew old. Their stories stop abruptly in the mud of Belgium. And every veteran who did come home, like Albert, lived with the knowledge that others had not been given that chance. Survivors carried not only injuries, but the memory of the men who worked beside them. Starting with the photo, and to understand the Edwards family, we must begin with Elsie Agnes Austin. She was born into hardship in Birmingham. Her parents' relationship collapsed when she was very young, and she and her mother were sent to a poorhouse, one of the harshest institutions in early 20th century Britain. Poorhouses were not shelters. They were places of last resort, crowded, punitive, designed to deter anyone from seeking relief. Children were separated, routines were strict, and food was minimal. When Elsie was only about 4, her mother died. She then returned to her father's household, growing up among half-siblings in the working-class districts of Birmingham. Life was stable enough, but never easy. She learned early what it meant to work, to endure, and to survive. As a young woman, she found employment at Cadbury's, a factory known for its progressive welfare standards. Cadbury's was a factory in a garden built on Quaker values. Education rooms, sports clubs, and medical care. For women like Elsie, and indeed many of her family, it offered security, dignity, and a sense of belonging. But her life would change forever when a young Australian soldier recovering from gas injuries appeared at the family door. What followed would then become a legend of love at first sight. Alphonsus and Elsie married at St Mary's in Harborne in 1919. Both carried the weight of their pasts, and both saw in the other a future worth fighting for. The post-war years in Britain were bleak. Unemployment, rationing, housing shortages. For many British war brides, Australia represented hope, a chance for land, work, and a life free from the rigid class structures of industrial England. Elsie boarded the Katoomba with Albert in 1920, never to return to the UK. She left behind the only world she had ever known, stepping into the unknown for love, not certainty. In the 1920s, the Edwards family flourished, and a number of children were born over the next decade. They lived simply but respectably. Their home was clean, children well dressed, their routines were steady. But beneath the surface lay the slow, inexorable consequences of fighting in the war. Mustard gas injuries do not heal. They might lie dormant, flare unexpectedly, and carve away at the lungs, skin, and immune system. Throughout the 1920s, Alphonsus's health deteriorated, with chronic bronchitis, repeated infections, difficulty breathing, fatigue, voice weakness, and vulnerability to colds and pneumonia. Reparation clinics provided limited support. His ability to work was sharply reduced. Medical boards assessed a permanent loss of earning capacity, a quiet acknowledgement of a life shortened by war. By 1929, the world plunged into an economic crisis, and Australia was hit particularly hard. Unemployment rose above 30%. Families often crowded into small homes. Food was rationed informally through careful budgeting and sacrifice. For a large family and an invalid veteran, the pressures were immense. Elsie really became the anchor, managing the household, caring for a sick husband, raising the children, stretching every pound, and coping with the social isolation of life far from her family roots in Birmingham. Her strength had been forged in childhood hardship, and now it sustained the entire household. The end, when it came, was quiet. On 17th of September 1933, Albert Joseph Edwards died. He was only 39 years old. The war had taken 15 years to claim him, but claim him it did. The Repatriation Department recognised his death as war-related, a solemn admission that mustard gas continues killing long after the trenches go quiet. His funeral marked the end of one life, but the beginning of a deeper struggle. Elsie was a widow in her 30s with a large family in the middle of the Depression in a country far from where she had grown up. And yet she endured, particularly with the support of organisations like Legacy. She built the routines. She kept the family together. She ensured that her children grew into capable, dignified adults. The same resilience that carried her from the workhouse to Cadbury's, from Cadbury's to Australia, now carried her through widowhood. On the high ground near Ypres, standing alone in a landscape once torn apart by explosives, is a memorial to the men of the first Australian tunnelling company who never came home. Their names are carved into stone. Sappers, engineers, miners, men who lived and died underground in 1916 and 1917. This monument overlooks the shattered contours of Hill 60, where the earth itself still bears the scars of war beneath. It is a place that Albert knew well. Even though he arrived after the grapevines were blown at Messines, he walked across this ground, worked in its tunnels, and stood shoulder to shoulder with the men whose names appear here. The memorial honours those killed outright in explosions, in cave-ins, in sudden breakthroughs with German tunnellers. But it also represents those deaths who came later, quietly, invisibly, from gas damage, lung disease, and years of failing health. Men like Albert, whose war did not end in 1918, but followed him all the way to his untimely death in 1933. Standing before this memorial, one realises that the story of the tunnellers is not just about the thunder of mines and the heroism of underground combat. It is about endurance, sacrifice, and the often long shadow that service casts over families and generations. Among Albert and Elsie's children was Bernard Leslie Edwards. He had watched his father's long decline. He had grown up in a household marked by sacrifice, duty, and quiet resilience. On his 18th birthday, like so many young Australian men of the era, Bernie enlisted to serve in the Second World War. There was no drama in his decision, no romanticism. His family back in England were facing the dreadful perils through the rise of fascism. There was the simple belief that he held, common to his generation, that a debt of service was owed. Passing up the opportunity to enrol and study in medicine at Sydney University, he trained under the Empire Air Training Scheme, was posted to Britain and flew operationally with 466 Squadron as a gunner, operating in heavy bomber units conducting some of the most dangerous missions of the war. Unlike many of his comrades, Bernard survived. He returned to Australia, completed his studies and became a dentist, serving his community in peace as much as he had done in war. His life represents something really quite profound. Not redemption, not escape, but continuity and a belief that the burdens of freedom and service to underwrite that freedom is often shared across generations. The story of the Edwards family is not unique in Australia by any stretch. It is our story across 2 world wars. A father who served underground, blinded and burned by gas. A mother who crossed oceans, leaving her family behind to raise her own family here in Australia, enduring poverty and dreadful loss. A son who then stepped up when called, because stepping forward was what honour required. We often speak of war in numbers, casualties, battalions, divisions, and tonnage. But the real history of war is found in families like these. In the photographs that show life before illness, in childhoods shaped by service, at kitchen tables where grief sat quietly beside the bread, in the choices young men made because they believed freedom came with obligations. The Edwards family, and many like them in Australia, paid very dearly for the world in which we now inhabit. And in remembering them, we are reminded of a truth that we ignore at our peril. The quality of life that we enjoy today rests on the sacrifices of ordinary people who did extraordinary things in wartime. Not for glory, but because someone had to step forward. Someone had to serve. Service is often spoken of as an act, something done in uniform, in moments of danger or decision. But this family story reminds us that service does not end when a war ends or when a uniform is folded away. It continues in damaged lungs that never heal, in shortened lives, in widows who carry on alone, and in children who grow up shaped by what was given and what was lost, long before they were even born. Sacrifice, too, is rarely confined to the battlefield. It is found in the quiet endurance of those who remain, the mothers who rebuild households from grief, the children who learn responsibility early, the families who absorb the long-term costs of national decisions made far away. These sacrifices are not commemorated with medals or parades, yet they form the unseen foundation upon which remembrance itself rests. To remember service honestly is to acknowledge this full cost, not only the heroism of action, but the lifelong consequences that follow. In doing so, we honour not just those who stepped forward in times of war, but those who carried its weight in peacetime. Their legacy is not only one of loss, but of continuity, a reminder that the freedoms we inherit were paid for over decades, across generations, by ordinary Australian families who bore extraordinary burdens so that we all might live in peace.